I've talked for a very long time on this podcast, and particularly on this season of the podcast, about what I've termed Nietzsche's religion. It's a contentious idea, perhaps to some, because Nietzsche is an atheist, almost a priori, an atheist according to his own tastes, as he himself writes. A precondition of Nietzschean philosophy is to take the material world as our reality and not to entertain notions of a world beyond. And yet, through Nietzsche's work that deals with the ideals of the overman and the eternal recurrence and the amor fati idea, the love of fate, we see what it amounts to an attempt by Nietzsche to fulfill the psychological, moral, and even, dare we say it, spiritual function that religion serves, albeit with a completely different values system, and one which I think Nietzsche is setting out to craft a religion that would meet the demands that it be grounded within the world of phenomena and experience, and one which will be based, and here's the key point, on the flourishing of life rather than on abstractions or prejudices or pathologies. So the overman is a replacement for the God idea, rather than, in having our faith in something which is from eternal and from a world beyond, and which is overman in the sense that God is overman, right? The overman in Nietzsche's idealization is a future evolution or progression for mankind in an idealized form, a perfected version of mankind that is infinitely above us, but that which we're ever proceeding towards. So that replaces what God did for the human psyche. And then we have the eternal recurrence, which is the replacement for heaven, rather than after death you going off to some other place that is eternal. This life becomes eternal, and thus the value always cannot leak out of this world into another, but always flows back into the material world. And, amor fati, we could sort of say is like, Nietzsche is directly influenced by Spinoza and the idea of amor Dei, which is a love of God. For Spinoza, it's a deistic God. For Nietzsche, it's love of fate. It's, Nietzsche is, as we've said, predisposed to atheism. And so his conception of the kind of faith that one might, find sustaining, what we're going to have a love of or the faith in is not a personal deity, but in necessity, we might say. And so that is his attempt to sort of replace or fulfill needs that Christianity had fulfilled. Now I want to turn to look instead, or conversely, at what Nietzsche sees as the alternative to his new religion of life. Because it's very easy to say, well, Nietzsche had some grand ideas, and perhaps some of his critiques can be useful to us now. He certainly had his great influence on many artists and thinkers, but how practical are his ideas really? Can we really live the way that Zarathustra encourages us to live? Is it really advisable to live dangerously, to sacrifice yourself in order to bring forth something greater, or to make war on our own happiness and our own contentment? Find the will to be dissatisfied and search for something beyond your life as it is now. Is that advisable, or should we perhaps take the Carl Jung view, the Jordan Peterson view, that our traditional Judeo-Christian morality and the conventions of society are time-honored, well-tested things, not just for thousands of years, but coming out of a process of human evolution by natural selection, which means that there are probably certain cultural memes or what would we say, the makeup of the collective unconscious that is so inculcated into mankind that it's been here for millions of years, right? We should default to the moral ideas that have always worked. Nietzsche may be exciting, he may be inspiring, we may even accept that it's healthy to be a free thinker and entertain arguments against one's own enculturation, But to what degree can Nietzsche really offer us something, beyond this? I mean, why should we challenge the morality of convention and the beliefs of the majority? Not just as an experiment, mind you, but as a way of life. Why? If Nietzsche argues that values are so necessary for human life, should we not fight to uphold the values of Christianity and Enlightenment society? I would put it to you here that the best argument for why we cannot do so, in Nietzsche's words, is found in Nietzsche's extensive notes on the topic of nihilism. That's the topic of today's talk. We're going to explore what nihilism means to Nietzsche, where it comes from, and what it causes. And while we've undoubtedly touched on the topic of nihilism many times already, today we're looking at the notes collected in Will to Power, of which the entire first section is dedicated to the topic of nihilism, which Nietzsche begins the book by saying he believes it's coming immediately, or to Europe, rather. He says that, in fact, the arrival of nihilism on a mass scale is something that can no longer come differently. It's a rather infamous passage these days because it seems almost too prophetic, and I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on that. The reason why I think this is sort of the best answer in Nietzsche's work to that question I posed, why not go back to the conventional morality or conventional religion? And that's because Nietzsche sees the nihilistic outcome that our society is now facing down the barrel of as a direct consequence of the conventional morality and religion. Nihilism that we see now arriving, or that we're now starting to see clearly in the evaporating faith of the Christian religion, that much is true. It's appearing as Christianity dies off. And yet, as Nietzsche argues in his notes, and from many different angles, nihilism, I mean, for one, it's an inevitable consequence of where we're at now, but it's also, the seeds of it are already contained within Christianity, and Christianity has in many ways made it worse. The situation we're in today is Christianity drawing its necessary conclusions, and that winding back the clock is therefore not possible. In terms of a metaphor, it's sort of like saying, well, I like the seed, but I hate the plant, right? Maybe I would suggest that we find some way to turn that plant back into a seed. Let's turn that nihilism plant back into a Christianity seed. Not only can it not be done, it sounds ridiculous because it's just a misunderstanding of the relationship between the two, between the seed and the plant. Nihilism is not the absence of Christianity, but its consequence. And so it's contained in Christianity's essence. It's something about Christianity being realized. And so Nietzsche writes in 1888, and this is in Will to Power number 30, quote, "The time has come when we have to pay for having been Christians for 2,000 years, end quote. So the argument, quite simply, is that we don't have a choice or an option of freezing things where they are or going back to an earlier state of affairs. For Nietzsche, and this is sort of a key point that's going to really tie into a lot of today's discussion or my analysis of these notes, life is either ascending or it's descending. There's no standing still. If we continue going down the road set by the traditional religion and its morality, we will simply be going further and further into nihilism. His argument, I think Nietzsche's argument for taking seriously his new Nietzschean religion is consider the alternative. That he's not just sort of saying this arbitrarily or as an exciting thing you can try because it's fun. I think he's saying, look, we have a real problem here that our society and our value system is exhausted. It's running on the fumes of a bunch of moral assumptions that we have from a religion that is now dead or in the process of dying. At the very least, that we don't have any kind of like unquestionable faith in as a society that we used to. And so where is that going to lead us? And that's what he thinks is nihilism, what we'll talk about today. But I guess that's why I wanted to introduce the idea of nihilism that way is because that is the whole reason for why Nietzsche would come up with such, I mean, if you think about it, rather bizarre ideas, like the overman, right? Why do we need an overman? This is why. Nihilism for Nietzsche, it's a real thing. It's a real problem. It's a physical phenomenon. It's something that does actually exist in the world. For Nietzsche, the cultural is physical. And so his Nietzschean religion of life is like it's a means of giving us another road to the nihilistic road that we're currently on. We're on, a declining path in Nietzsche's view. So before we get deeper into the text, I want to sort of preface the discussion by drawing attention to the familiar dichotomy, which many of you will probably recognize immediately. As Nietzsche puts it in Ecce Homo, when summing up the central project of his work, it's Dionysus versus the crucified. This dichotomy, or this opposition, whatever you want to call it, it occurs throughout Nietzsche's career or throughout his work, beginning with a sort of provisional version appearing in the opposition between Hellenism and Socratism and the birth of tragedy. It's expressed in the genealogy of morality and the master morality versus the slave morality. Master morality is associated with the pagan Greeks, slave morality with Christianity. And interestingly, I think perhaps the most relevant way that Nietzsche uses this opposition is insofar as he uses it implicitly and as a tool. Whenever in his work he wishes to draw a dichotomy between two manifestations of something that we've confounded under a single label. This is the sense in which he speaks of a pessimism of strength, but on the other hand, there's also a pessimism of weakness. It's the sense in which he speaks of a romanticism emerging from ascending life, from like a vigorous youthful energy versus the romanticism of a weak, despairing, sick person, right? That was how he criticized Schopenhauer and Wagner. And so we've talked about all these iterations of the Dionysus versus the crucified framework. I actually did an episode on that, so you can go back and listen to that. But Nietzsche uses it to evaluate concepts, philosophical movements, motivations, moral values, and so on. And while Nietzsche gets a lot of attention for pointing out, it's sort of his MO in Beyond Good and Evil, mainly in the first chapter, and it's sort of how I thought of how Nietzsche's approach, or one of his approaches for a long time. But it's one that gets a lot of attention. He draws out how many of our supposed dichotomies created by language are false. He did this in Human All Too Human too. I mean, he wonders in both of those texts, are there any opposites at all, or are opposite valuations or things that we have determined to be opposites in our language, are these not simply gradations of one another, right? Famously, he asks, does selflessness come from selfishness? Are the most moral virtues grown on the soil of immorality? And so, like truth and falsehood, that's actually another great one, that those are not mutually exclusive. That, for example, truth may rest on falsehood. And so that's one method, is to look at how there are two alleged opposites, which are actually just gradations of the same underlying thing, or which depend on some sort of on one underlying process or relationship. They're not mutually exclusive at all. They're actually mutually dependent or mutually arising. But another method Nietzsche has, and this is how he uses the Dionysus versus Christian dichotomy, he'll take a concept like pessimism and point out how, depending on what pessimism is being driven by, this one term could indicate two totally contradictory impulses. Is this a pessimism of weakness or a pessimism of strength? And again, on more on that specific metaphor, it's in the Dionysus versus the crucified episode. But for him, the most fundamental opposition is always between what is life-affirming, life-promoting, versus what is harmful to life, what is life-negating. And so the way Nietzsche goes about this, it's like an implicit method, as I've called it. he treats the Dionysus Christianity opposition as a true opposition. This is not a dialectic. I feel I should clarify this because there's much more awareness of what the dialectic is these days. This is an observation, an important observation of Deleuze about Nietzsche's work. Nietzsche wrote of the silent hostility with which Christianity was treated in his first book, Birth of Tragedy. And Deleuze highlights in his work, although I don't think he doesn't use the same comparison, but Nietzsche's whole career is sort of like a silent hostility to Hegel and the Hegelian dialectic. Hegel is the philosopher most associated with the dialectic. Dialectic, it's a process by which the mind brings into the collective consciousness the awareness of its own contradictions. And so Hegel's dialectic, the human mind as a sort of collective subject, has to reconcile these contradictions through a continuous process of overcoming previous contradictions, which in turn gives rise to new ones. And so Hegel had written famously of the master-slave dialectic. That greatly influenced Karl Marx. To give a brief summary or a greatly oversimplified version of the idea, two people enter into a relationship where one is master and the other is a slave. But through this unequal power relationship, which has like injustice as part of it, and therefore is not fully satisfying to either one of them for various reasons, this brings each into the awareness of their position in respect to the other one, relative to the other. In Marxist terms, that's where you get class consciousness, and thus perception of class as such, right? That's a prerequisite to have something like a socialist revolution. Before you can revolt against the class structure, you have to become aware there is a class structure. So one of Hegel's more famous quotations is that all of human history constitutes one long struggle toward freedom, that we evolved from these more brutal forms of servitude, but that our further intellectual and moral development is a direct result of that servitude existing. Humankind as a collective subject learned from these experiences of bringing these power relationships into our consciousness, and as a result, humans morally and intellectually and socially develop, right? So Nietzsche certainly uses a form of analysis in some parts of his work where he does talk about concepts similarly to this. I mentioned the idea before of truth and falsehood as not opposites in Nietzsche's way of thinking, right? I guess what I'm saying is Nietzsche is not necessarily, this is where I disagree with Deleuze, a philosopher of difference as such, where he thinks just like there is, that everything is just about creating these fundamental oppositional differences. No, Nietzsche also does point out where things are mutually dependent rather than mutually exclusive. But I think when it comes to the issue of whether something is life ascending or whether it's an example of life descending, what's interesting about that, and I think is very intuitive to grasp, is that's an indication of direction, up or down, right? We live in a moving reality, and duration is, in some sense, an illusion for Nietzsche. This is coming off of his influence from Heraclitus. It's an illusion. Duration is an illusion that's only relevant to you based on the timescale of your biological existence. So reality is always moving. Living phenomena are always moving. Are they moving in a direction that makes them stronger and healthier, or weaker and more dissolute? And for Nietzsche, this is an absolute opposition, this way or the other way. There's no synthesis of those two opposing directions. There's no sense to that at all. If you have a binary, if you have, even if you conceive of it as a spectrum or a scale, you have to go in one direction or the other. And so in practice, it's more complicated than this when we talk about specific issues, I guess, because, even with nihilism, as we'll see as we go on into the text, Nietzsche is willing to break up nihilism into different kinds of nihilism. He talks about a lot of different angles in nihilism. So, for example, active nihilism and passive nihilism. Effectively, the same thing as when he's talking about pessimism. Nihilism of strength versus nihilism of weakness. It's one form of nihilism that is going to lead to ascending life, and there is another form that will lead to descending life. And it almost muddies up the issue almost intentionally, where it makes it hard to talk about this. But I think Nietzsche does that because he recognizes how in every word concept, we end up conflating things. This is Nietzsche's way, or we either end up differentiating things where there's not a distinction, or conflating things that should be distinguished in many cases. And oftentimes what your language groups together or doesn't group together or excludes from certain concepts is sort of a cultural accident in a way. And I think Nietzsche is trying to smash through these barriers of language and its limitations by applying this method that he can apply to any word. No matter which label he chooses to use, he can be beyond the label by targeting every label, even the core terms of his philosophy, with this same critical framework, we could say, that he attacks the word itself as, in some sense, a false concept which wrongly conflates different things. And so breaking words into two aspects, which correspond to these two underlying potential directions for life, Nietzsche sees those directions he's trying to point to, that phenomenon, that is the most important and real thing in terms of its consequences for our existence. That's what he wants us to recognize. So, the words, the actual philosophical or linguistic concepts we use aren't as important as getting to that underlying truth, if that makes sense. And so we'll see Nietzsche talks about in nihilism in a couple of different ways, where nihilism need not be this terrible ending. It can also be a preliminary step or a state of being that's it's merely one in a series which you have to pass through with great difficulty, but you're all the better for it on the other side, right? But I just want everyone to keep that in mind. That's the framework that we're approaching it with, and it even applies to, because you could say we have Nietzsche's religion of life, the Übermensch idea, eternal return, amor fati, all those things I mentioned at the beginning, and he's saying, so that's the life ascending phenomena, and then nihilism is the alternative, the Christian inherited beliefs that are still making our society sick, right? You have it right there, Dionysus versus the crucified. But then Nietzsche has to go and take nihilism and break nihilism into the Dionysian nihilism versus the crucified nihilism, right? And so you can really do that forever. But so the important thing is that you're able to see the opposition he's pointing to. You can break up words and terms forever and do that infinitely with your system. The perceiving the opposition is the key thing. So lacing this entire section of notes is a very clear association of Christianity with the life descending and the life denying, as we've said, ultimately with nihilism and nihilistic impulses. And so I should also make another thing clear too before we go on. When we're talking about Christianity here, we don't even necessarily mean religious Christianity as taught in the church. But again, the conventional morality which we largely hold to in the West. It's like Christianity is a series of memes. And the fact is, because of the scientific revolution, we've had to drop a bunch of the superstitious or metaphysical aspects of Christianity. Now, this has had dire consequences, and we'll talk about that as we get into these passages, but many of those memes of Christianity still survive, or we're still trying to hold on to, or we're trying to transmute them into another form or find them elsewhere. These are ideas like universal equality of mankind, pity-based, compassion-based morality, ideas of humility, love, kindness, charity as cardinal virtues. There's plenty of people who believe these things, either implicitly or explicitly, but they are atheists, right? That's, I would say that's very common, actually. So Nietzsche gives many potential definitions for nihilism throughout the section, which is important to know what we're talking about. But it's pulled together from all his notes on the subject, so there's all sorts of different ways of defining it. In some sense, it's wonderful because we get to see different approaches in thinking. Also, I should say, because these are notes, many sections are almost like a skeleton of Nietzsche's prose, the way it appears in his published works. You get a lot more numbered lists and more outlines and abbreviations for ideas and so on. in many ways, this is also very helpful because Nietzsche writes so explicitly in these passages. He doesn't have his mask on, like he talks about in Beyond Good and Evil, or at least, maybe he does. It's just not the same mask. So in any case, he defines nihilism. Quote, "The highest values devalue themselves. The aim is lacking. Why? Finds no answer." End quote. So, relatively straightforward definition. That's what people mean when they say life has no meaning. They can find no purpose for their own lives that make coherent sense, or for life in general. No goal they can find a reason to believe in. The more interesting part for our purposes is the highest values devalue themselves. So Christianity provided that meaning. Christianity was the source of the highest values formerly, but they devalued themselves. So the way that Christianity did this provided the very cause of its downfall. So what meaning did it provide? This is in Will to Power number 4, referring to Christianity. Quote, "It granted man an absolute value, as opposed to his smallness and accidental occurrence in the flux of becoming and passing away." End quote. So the world we truly live in is that Heraclitean ever-living fire. I would say Nietzsche is much more metaphysically neutral in his notes, or in his published works rather, but in his notes, he's very open about just sort of talking nonchalantly about the world as this Heraclitean becoming, which makes me think he really did believe that himself. But, all phenomena are impermanent. They're terminally impermanent, including all life on Earth, including human life. And even though we have these incredible brains by which we have a personality and memories and, people we love, and we'd wish that these things would endure eternally, they don't. All of our knowledge and experiences, in fact, an aberration. In a world that existed long before us without knowledge, it's sort of horrifying. And this is not just simply the old problem of fear of death or fear of mortality, but the sense of insignificance, the awful idea that all of our accomplishments and our triumphs are just like a Tibetan sand mandala, just to be swept away. And so Christianity provided a psychological advantage in this respect by telling a story in which mankind and the choices of mankind and man's beliefs are very important. It establishes something eternal, God, the kingdom of heaven, right? And then it asserts that this eternal world that it describes is the true world. It's the world of permanence, of essence, of static categories of being. And so it ties human value not to this world, which is a world of becoming and passing away, but to this proposed eternal world, right? And so Nietzsche goes on to write, Christianity served other functions as well. It made evil meaningful, right? That's a very big one. The suffering and the evil of the world in the Christian framework can actually be made comprehensible. It can be understood, in the most basic sense, as a punishment of some kind. But it has a meaning because it's like a necessary process on the road to perfection for mankind. Whereas before, totally malicious acts, that just would be seen as senseless, or just the random, the natural disasters that the theologians are always talking about and the problem of evil. But that may appear senseless outside of the world as moral battleground that Christianity establishes. But since the world is this place of moral development, one gains this ability to comprehend and even process evil when it appears, right? Christianity creates a language for talking about evil, and it makes it actually a useful thing. This even took on, this is not like a common Christian belief, but I believe some sects of Christianity who were a little more extreme, I'm talking really more medieval or older, and I can't remember the name of them at the moment, but they believed that, Christ's sacrifice is made greater the more sin that he forgives. So it's actually a good thing if you sin, because you're making Christ's sacrifice even greater, right? So just be repentant and be a good Christian, but then, sin as much as you can within reason, just to make Christ's sacrifice even better, because you're even more of a sinner that he has to redeem. We can see how any church, doctrines, of a mainstream sect would have to take issue with that and see it as a heresy. But we can see the logic there, perverse as it is, because evil and imperfection, it doesn't become this, fatal flaw in existence in a purely atheistic, meaningless, like Schopenhauerian world, right? The tragedy of life becomes something which we are redeemed from, which changes the meaning of it. So, and Nietzsche says it also prevented mankind from despising life itself. This is sort of related. So, or from people despising their fellow man. And Nietzsche accordingly calls Christianity a means of preservation even. And so just because of Christianity's nihilistic essence, we have to recognize the functions that it did fulfill and how it fulfilled them rather well. Now, we may take it for granted that Christianity is declining and that we're increasingly becoming a secular civilization. That's largely due to the advancement of science, disproving of many of the cosmological assertions of Christianity. And so the reason for Christianity's decline is that even though in theory one could have a mature Christianity, and many people do, in general, we tend to make our decisions based on empirical evidence and the scientific method. I mean, at least when it comes to things that we really give a damn about, right? Like medical science, flying planes, resource allocation, whether to go to war. This maybe doesn't apply to everybody, but decisions are generally not made using the Bible as the final authority or the church as the final authority in really any domain of life any longer. Christian values are no longer ubiquitous and unquestioned. I would say it's fair to say the Christian religion is more questionable than ever today. And so this is why Nietzsche writes in Will to Power, number 5, quote, "But among the forces cultivated by morality was truthfulness. This eventually turned against morality," end quote. So, of course, the moral person must be a truthful person. But the problem when taking truthfulness through to its ultimate conclusions is that we discover that morality itself is based on falsehoods, or rather, perspectival truths, valuations about life which are not absolute nor transcendent, but very much rooted in biological and thus physiological and psychological preferences. The why, the goal for life that Christianity provided cannot be found to the same degree when one turns to naturalistic explanations. I mean, certainly there are many secular moral theories, but we're not asking the question here of whether or not mankind can figure out how to act in absentia of a transcendent moral authority. I mean, certainly we can, and people do, many people do. So this is not the sense that we're thinking about morality here. Not simply determining how man ought to act, which is perhaps a very basic interpretation of what ethics is, but rather Nietzsche is saying one of the things a transcendent morality gave us by telling us that there is a way to live, which has this transcendent stamp of approval, is that it made human actions and thus human life meaningful in a way that arguably ideologies like utilitarianism can never do. I mean, you might think utilitarianism is a perfectly workable moral framework, and you can arguably say that it isn't meant to provide us with the meaning of life, right? But Nietzsche would argue, or he might argue, that the old moral code did provide that, and whether or not that's what you're interested in creating with your secular morality, man has lost something by losing that sense of meaning in his actions. So he writes in Will to Power, section 18, quote, "The most universal sign of the modern age, man has lost dignity in his own eyes to an incredible extent. For a long time, the center and tragic hero of existence in general, then at least intent on proving himself closely related to the decisive and essentially valuable side of existence, like all metaphysicians who wish to cling to the dignity of man, with their faith that moral values are cardinal values. Those who have abandoned God cling that much more firmly to the faith in morality." End quote. And so we've talked about this before, but Nietzsche, in some sense, sees the entire history of the West, since Christendom at least, as sort of a series of transmutations of our perspective, which nevertheless, flows forth from the same underlying impulses. In the idea of the universal brotherhood of men, or we might say the premise that all men are created equal, or here he's talking about the dignity of man, it's simply an echo of the idea that all stand equal in the eyes of the Lord, or whatever the religious language may be, that the moral grasping for some means of affirming the dignity of man is unconsciously from that same impulse to give a transcendent meaning to all human life. And when the religion no longer seems tenable metaphysically, those same impulses are expressed all the more strongly in moral language. Let's go down to Will to Power number 20. This is a very rich passage, I would say. Quote, "The nihilistic question, for what, is rooted in the old habit of supposing that the goal must be put up, given, demanded, from outside, by some superhuman authority. Having unlearned faith in that, one still follows the old habit and seeks another authority that can speak unconditionally and command goals and tasks. The authority of conscience now steps up front. The more emancipated one is from theology, the more imperativistic morality becomes, to compensate for the loss of a personal authority. Or the authority of reason, or the social instinct, the herd. Or history with an immanent spirit and a goal within, so one can entrust oneself to it. One wants to get around the willing of a goal, the risk of positing a goal for oneself. One wants to rid oneself of responsibility. One would accept fatalism. Finally, happiness, and with a touch of Tartuffe, the happiness of the greatest number. One says to oneself, 1. A definite goal is not necessary at all. 2. Cannot possibly be anticipated. Just now, when the greatest strength of will would be necessary, it is weakest and least confident. Absolute mistrust regarding the organizing strength of the will for the whole." End quote. Yeah, I mean, it's like, if you think Nietzsche includes an abundance of ideas, he packs so much into short passages and condensed aphorisms, in his published work. But the material from the notes collected in Will to Power, it seems like that, but turned up to 11. So we'll try to disentangle all of this. Having learned that we're not going to find this transcendent authority to impart meaning to human life, we nevertheless still look for some kind of authority that can speak unconditionally and issue commands. So what does that mean? Notice the examples of what Nietzsche gives of what this authority might be: reason, history, social instinct. So and the first potential authority, actually, I skipped over. When the abandonment of theism is perhaps still fresh or not all the way completed, the conscience. But it gets more imperativistic, so more Kantian, the more removed one is from religion. The conscience is like the immediate leftover of our moral intuitions as given by some sort of higher authority. And then as we proceed further and further from theology, we more and more try to justify the intuitions of our conscience through reason, which I think is why that's one of the next ones Nietzsche brings up. But conscience, again, it's perceived as a sort of voice from within, our intuition held up as evidence that there's some sort of divine commandment over our actions. So we defer to our conscience out of an unwillingness to act as our own authority. So we're always trying to abdicate our own authority. We don't wish to have to posit a goal for ourselves. That's frightening, and most people are not up to the challenge. And so we naturally look for something to guide our lives and our actions. And so we seek it, it would be a very primitive understanding to try and find that in another human being. Some people do, but mostly we seek it in these abstract concepts. These are still things which exist in the phenomenal world, in a way that maybe a deity perhaps does not, but nevertheless something like reason, right? Reason is an abstract idea. When you say, well, my guiding principle is reason. I mean, most people think that they're trying to be reasonable. Usually when somebody's saying that, they're trying to invoke something as like this, something that's universally binding on all human minds, or something which every mind and principle has access to if we were to so choose. And that can therefore provide some sort of authority separate from any one human mind. So we can use logic as our authority, like the Vulcans do, and defer our responsibility for our actions and our way of life that way. Or we might use history, as the Hegelians do, right? He's referencing Hegel there, with everything we talked about earlier. As he describes that conception of history as an immanent spirit and a goal within. It's largely a response to the historical turn in philosophy, which was initiated by Hegel. All of these are attempts to regain what we previously had in the idea of God, but by using some earthly authority as a substitute, albeit not an individual personified one, but like a sort of, in the same way that God is both personal, but also there's this like Holy Spirit idea, and this part of God that's sort of mysterious and infinite, and therefore it's very hard to conceive of the infinite as personal, right? And so it's almost like that aspect of God is what we look for, is something abstract, universal, or intuitive in some manner. These are the kind of things that we'll trust as an authority over our own will. And that seems to be a sort of a kind of tragedy for Nietzsche. This is a moment in which will is decisive, and when someone with the willingness to do so could bring about a revaluation, a personal revaluation of values, if nothing else. But instead, the norm seems to be to aim for comfort, which is descending life, rather than the terrifying prospect that one become his own legislator of values. The final step here that Nietzsche lays out is very clearly correlated with utilitarianism. The greatest good for the greatest many. And so the culmination of our abdication of authority, or really of our abdication of the quest to even find meaning, which is what we might call, Nietzsche's sort of seeing it in like the essence of the herd mentality. It's like the culmination of all of these things we want to put our authority in. The final step is one looking to the greatest many as the authority. And in absentia of any kind of greater project for mankind, we simply look to preserve ourselves, maintain or increase our happiness or our comfort. And utilitarianism, I should point out, doesn't mean doing this selfishly. That would indicate the kind of willpower Nietzsche thinks we don't really possess, right? Instead, we do it universally or altruistically on a universalist basis. And so the final consequence of this is utilitarian moral thinking. What would it look like if, in this same position, the will wasn't lacking? As mentioned, Nietzsche entertains the notion of nihilism as possibly being an intermediary stage, or as a potentially positive thing, if used as a stepping stone to something else. The moral and spiritual crisis in the wake of Christianity's demise opens up the possibility of a mass descent into nihilism. But here, I think we should really use that Nietzschean tool of separating those who end up in nihilism from the strong impulses, from those who end up in nihilism as a result of weak impulses. And so Nietzsche writes in section 23, I'll quote here in an abridged form, quote, "Nihilism as a normal condition. It can be a sign of strength. The spirit may have grown so strong that previous goals, convictions, articles of faith, have become incommensurate. Or a sign of the lack of strength to posit for oneself a goal, a why, a faith," end quote. And so there we see it again. Further down in the passage, he characterizes Buddhism as passive nihilism, or rather the weak form of nihilism. He calls it a sign of weakness wherein one's strength is all spent. And so, he's using it as a metaphor here. I mean, the definitive difference between the active nihilist, somebody who passes into nihilism not as a pathological condition, and the passive nihilist, which is somebody who sort of falls into it out of exhaustion, is that the active nihilist is there because of his strength to attack. He has attacked, and he's attacked his own convictions or his own happiness or his own morality, and he's won his victory of demolishing that previously held conviction. And that can land you in a place of nihilism. But he's done this in order to build something new out of the rubble, out of his own authority, so to speak. So Nietzsche writes in section 26, quote, "The pessimism of active energy, the question, for what, after a terrible struggle, even victory, that something is 100 times more important than the question of whether we feel well or not. Basic instinct of all strong natures, and consequently also whether others feel well or not. In sum, that we have a goal for which one does not hesitate to offer human sacrifices, to risk every danger, to take upon oneself whatever is bad and worst, the great passion." End quote. And so it's only natural that after a great victory, the emptiness sets in. That's Alexander weeping because he has no more worlds to conquer, right? Active nihilism is actually a rather beautiful thing to Nietzsche. And throughout this passage, he explores the connection of pessimism to nihilism. He sees pessimism as a sort of preliminary stage to nihilism, but there are in both cases manifestations that he admires, and even admires greatly. And I should point out that when it comes to philosophy, Nietzsche's own criticisms of morality, or of language, or of the concept of truth itself are sometimes characterized as nihilistic. A moral realist would probably call Nietzsche a moral nihilist. You could even call him like an epistemological nihilist in some sense. What's important for him is not which word you use to characterize his beliefs, though, whether you class him as a nihilist or not, but that you understood his attacks on these things as of a similar mindset. These are attacks against dogmas. Clearing away these wrong and dead ideas allows for new things to grow. In the immediate aftermath, there is that stage of nihilism, which the thinker must pass through, but it's a intermediary stage before you can move on to something new. And Nietzsche reflects on this personally. Actually, it's in the note before this one. This is in number 25. Quote, "It is only late that one musters the courage for what one really knows. That I have hitherto been a thoroughgoing nihilist, I have admitted to myself only recently. The energy and radicalism with which I advanced as a nihilist deceived me about this basic fact. When one moves towards a goal, it seems impossible that goallessness as such is the principle of our faith." End quote. It's a very fascinating passage, actually, which I think it expresses how the dynamics of some of these concepts make them difficult to talk about in a totally coherent way, because Nietzsche here admits to being, first things first, he admits to being a nihilist up until recently. It's sort of what the gist of it is. And so when was this written? 1887. Interestingly, right before he's writing the Antichrist. In the Antichrist, he begins the book by saying, all right, I've had enough of this modern sort of wishy-washiness with holding both a for and against simultaneously. The formula for our happiness is a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. And yet, he says in this passage, he still had his goals before, which he pursued with, plenty of energy, but goallessness as such, he finally recognized as a principle of his faith, meaning he perceives how all of his goals pursued with such effort were essentially destructive. Or I think this note somewhat indicates, if not a change in Nietzsche's philosophical positions, a recognition that something else was needed in his philosophy, which I think is the impetus for writing the Antichrist in the first place. And the Antichrist is one of the books that makes the Dionysus versus Christianity idea the clearest, by the way. And so we can take this whole idea further. Nietzsche writes in section 28, quote, Main proposition: how complete nihilism is the necessary consequence of the ideals entertained hitherto. Incomplete nihilism, its forms, we live in the midst of it. Attempts to escape nihilism without reevaluating our values so far, they produce the opposite, make the problem more acute. End quote. And so here he suggests almost that the problem perhaps with the passive nihilists is that their nihilism is incomplete. It actually takes energy, it takes some courage, some vitality to take nihilism to the extreme, to its full conclusions. Dare to refute all values as you hold them or as they exist, or all the supposedly sacrosanct truths you used to believe in. Attack the true world, or attack the idea that truth and falsehood are not opposites, for example, right? You think of any philosophers who might have done something like that? So I think that's a way of making sense of how Nietzsche can simultaneously attack all morality, call himself an immoralist, attempt to demolish moral dogmas, but then also here be presenting nihilism as this grave danger which is approaching Europe, and which is in general understood, although we've been talking about sort of active nihilism, it can be in general understood as a symptom of exhaustion and sickliness, right? And so his argument is we have to do this and carry it out to the full in order to effect a revaluation, to emerge from nihilism completely. That is the healthy way of encountering nihilism, is to go all the way, go fully in, and then come back on the other side. Instead, we live in the midst of like a partial nihilism. And I think this is inherently tied in with the passive nihilist idea, because it's partial nihilism because we're accepting nihilism passively. We don't take it on as a result of our personal authority, right? But rather we abdicate our authority to the greatest number. And that is a kind of passivity. And of course, in that situation, the only values we can realistically pursue is the happiness of the greatest number, as we've already said. And so we don't complete the task of venturing totally into this abyss of nihilism, because the proximate goals that we set, perhaps, towards utilitarian ends, just to use one example, distract us from the ultimate goallessness of our lives. Just as Nietzsche says in that earlier passage that he distracted himself from his own thoroughgoing nihilism by the activity of working towards his own goals. And so it's something Nietzsche discusses a lot, that the will would rather will towards nothing rather than not will at all. That's the famous conclusion of the first essay of Genealogy of Morality. Nihilism doesn't just mean that we all just lay down and die. That's not part of the programming for human beings. When someone says, well, you're a nihilist, why don't you just kill yourself if life has no meaning? It's like people aren't wired that way. That's not what happens psychologically. But it does mean that we might begin... If our goals are sort of... our individual goals are decoupled from any sort of overarching goal, or if such a thing doesn't exist, it might mean that we begin working towards goals that are not commensurate with our lives or our well-being, or with creating further goals, which is a big, important thing to Nietzsche. That's really what the will to power does, is it creates higher and higher goals, greater and greater challenges, and thus greater overcomings, right, is the positive way to look at it. And so you might consider a basic goal. You have a goal every day of eating, getting a certain number of meals, right? 3 meals a day, right? So this goal arises, it arises due to hunger, a physiological cause, and then you satisfy it in accord with all these limitations, which are your schedule and your diet and all these other factors. But ultimately, it's a goal that you'll always have. Maybe it's easy to satisfy when you're in the ordinary rhythm of your life. Maybe it's sometimes hard to satisfy if you have to work through lunch or something like that. But what we can say definitively is that while figuring out what you're going to eat and then eating it is a goal, it's not a goal that typically leads on to other higher goals. It's a quotidian goal, right? You have to do it to continue living, but in and of itself, eating a meal doesn't lead to the destruction of value systems or the creation of new values or anything like that, right? the way that accomplishing one of your major life goals might have that effect, is like publishing a best-selling novel, or getting your dream job, or marrying your dream partner, and beyond any of those things, which are majorly important. In past ages, man also had religious or spiritual goals, like getting into heaven, or, just so on and so forth. So people can all have all sorts of goals, but not all goals are the same in how they satisfy the will to power, or how they actually, which Nietzsche would say, lead to ascending life. What ascending life really is taking on higher and higher goals, right? And so not all goals actually constitute a challenge to nihilism. Plenty of goals can take place within nihilism, and even goals which appear as leading in the direction of life's ascendance can, in the long term, turn out in retrospect to have ultimately been nihilistic. And that's what Nietzsche argues in the case of Christianity, and particularly like the value system of the ascetic priests. And so the human will is always going to continue to work away, Nietzsche predicts, but whereas this is really what the turn that has happened is, not that we've like lost the ability to have goals at all. It's a completely different thing. So whereas we once saw life as a problem and the otherworldly as the solution to that problem, and that was the goal, now we see this world. We've lost the faith in the otherworldly, and we have to see this world as the solution. But of course, that means we're still accepting that this world is a problem, right? Which speaks to the nihilistic principles underlining such a view, which are inherited from Christianity. And so Christianity has done these things that have made us yearn for things that can only be given to us by something transcendent. It's given us problems, or given us a perception of a problem, or colored the world in such a way that we need the transcendent to rescue us from it. When the transcendent's gone away, all we have is sort of the burden that it's left us with. And so many different movements have worked towards attempting to, quote unquote, solve the problem of life within the framework of the material world. For example, socialism is an obvious one, or the belief in the eventual triumph of truth, love, and justice, as Nietzsche puts it at one point in these notes. It's a very common belief. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And so we try to hang on to the moral ideas of Christianity, the problem here being that our moral intuitions tell us to exalt that which is selfless and unegotistical, even though Nietzsche argues, and I think rightly, that a sober look at human psychology as a phenomenon that emerges from nature indicates there's no unselfish actions or motivations. This is, I guess, sort of a side point, but Nietzsche writes in these sections that morality is sort of a condemnation on reality by its very nature, the very nature of moral thinking. It's a dynamite critique, really. Whenever one conceives of morality as any sort of transcendent judgment on the material world, emanating from this world beyond, this true world, morality naturally condemns our world. Whenever we utter an ought, we condemn what is. Any moral valuation is in some sense a critique, or it's a negation. So it's a very subversive idea, I think. It's a fascinating one. But related to this, then, we might look at what he writes in Will to Power. This is back earlier in the work, number 6, quote, "Insofar as we believe in morality, we pass sentence on existence," end quote. Which I think speaks for itself. If we want to dive into a little more source material for elaboration on this point, we could look to section 8, where he writes, quote, "The nihilistic consequence, the belief in valuelessness as a consequence of moral valuation. Everything egotistic has come to disgust us, even though we realize the impossibility of the unegotistic. What is necessary has come to disgust us, even though we realize the impossibility of any liberum arbitrum or intelligible freedom. We see that we cannot reach the sphere in which we have placed our values. But this does not by any means confer any value on that other sphere in which we live. On the contrary, we are weary because we have lost the main stimulus. In vain so far." End quote. And so I think this really helps, that section 8 there ties together a lot of what we've been looking at. It sort of helps elucidate the deeper meaning of the statement at the very beginning of this chapter, or this collection of notes, that nihilism is a result of the highest values devaluing themselves. Liberum arbitrum, the Latin phrase he uses in that passage, means free will, quite literally, and intelligible freedom, which he has in quotes, of course, originates with Kant and is utilized by Schopenhauer as a means of speaking rationally about man's supposed agency, his free will, his moral agency. And so the original idea of free will, that comes to us as a sort of divine spark within mankind. You have free will precisely because you have a soul. This is what makes us separate from the rest of deterministic nature. Without the transcendent origin for free will, without the doctrine of the immortal soul, you don't have a key part of intelligible freedom, right? You don't have the self. You don't have this coherent, static, durable thing called the self, which is not, in the soul doctrine, a mere aggregate. It's not a thing which shifts from moment to moment. It's an actual enduring thing. So without that soul doctrine, we're left trying to cobble together philosophical arguments for freedom of the will, such as Kant and Schopenhauer did. And Nietzsche suggests here that we know the impossibility of such freedom of the will. And yet, what is necessary, the idea that we live governed by necessity, has come to disgust us. In the same way that the egotistical has come to disgust us, even though, selfish, we can't find the basis to say that there are any selfless actions or unselfish motivations, or rather that everything's selfless in Nietzsche's view. He talks about this a great deal in Human Ulti Human. Everything selfless is built on a foundation of selfishness, right? That you can't separate the two. And so, but as Nietzsche writes, so these are all prejudices that we inherited from Christianity. They live on in our psychology, and we use them to pass sentence on the world, as he says. But we can no longer reach the sphere in which we placed those values. So that's the true world, the heavenly sphere, the eternal world. And so what has happened? Morality is past sentence on the world. That was bearable when this, what would you say? When this was part of our means of giving meaning to our lives within that world, right? When passing that judgment was part of the system of Christianity that in total did all these things to give meaning to our lives in the ways that Nietzsche talked about, that we talked about earlier in the talk, right? But now that we see the basis of that meaning has collapsed, the transcendent authority, we only have the condemnation left, right? And having indicted reality so, we now search for the means to redeem it. We search morality, politics, metaphysics, and so on, and pursue all sorts of goals in the meanwhile, of course, because the will can't stand a void. But beneath us is that nihilistic void, and we can't find solid ground for any of the transcendent things that we want out of morality or religion. And without those promises, without that faith, we simply end up pursuing our own happiness. That's the obvious conclusion. And the will always works in only one direction or the other. Always sets goals or challenges for itself to distract from this fundamental degeneration. And so Nietzsche writes in section 33, quote, "The most powerful desires of life that have the most future have hitherto been slandered, so a curse weighs on life," end quote. And so that's mostly just what we've been talking about. I mean, again, so if you were to say what the alternative is, I mean, Nietzsche believes his own philosophy or faith hinges on the opposite, on the fostering of life. And say what you will about that. I mean, you could say, who's going to come out and say they're against life, right? I mean, some people will, but like the misanthropes. But, perhaps we can find widespread agreement with Nietzsche, though, or perhaps this will be intuitively agreeable to people who might not be inclined to agree if we look at, say, sexuality. To the Christian church, sexuality was mostly just sinful. I mean, sure, sex between a married couple is morally permissible, especially if you're bearing children. Maybe even, being fruitful and multiplying is a good thing. It's a mitzvah or whatever we want to call it, using the Jewish term. But the sexual impulse as such is generally regarded with negative feelings among Christians. I mean, of course, St. Paul himself wrote, the best thing for people is to be celibate, but if you must have sex, it's better to marry than to burn. So sex is obviously central to human life, right? For obvious reasons. And so the rigidity around sexuality and the shame that was associated with the sexual impulse is therefore, it's easy to see the argument of how that could be considered harmful to life, right? Or we might consider Nietzsche's praise of war and warlike virtues. We don't like to think about or praise things like that today. But in the animal kingdom, the species that survives is the one that dominates its ecosystem and outcompetes other species of the same, tier or the same position in the food web or whatever you want to say. And in the case of the human race, as well as many other species, the members of the species that reproduce are those that sort of dominate in their own social hierarchy and are not displaced or destroyed by the other tribes or their other social hierarchies, right? And so I think it's a difficult argument to say that reproduction and survivability are not key virtues from the perspective of what helps life to succeed and flourish. So I don't think Nietzsche is just blustering. He has a viable critique in that he looks at all the ways Christianity actually fails to promote life by its promotion of chastity, peace, pity, and so on. It places a curse on the powerful desires of life. And that's why Nietzsche's Dionysian value system would be more in line with what promotes life by that token. I mean, he's arguing that in some sense simply by definition, because he's defining his Dionysian opposition to Christianity as being necessarily the opposite direction. Whichever direction Christianity would direct the will in this life-negating way, Nietzsche would direct it in a life-promoting way. There's a kind of funny passage in here I think goes a long way to addressing Nietzsche's opposition to utilitarianism, as we've talked about throughout. It addresses it even further. I'd preface this passage, I should say, by saying that Nietzsche's writing on the body and its drives becomes really relevant here. Nietzsche argues that pleasure and pain, since they exist solely within the nervous system as a reaction to a physiological stimulus, an external stimulus, they cannot themselves be used to judge the value of existence as such. They are stimulants to act in a certain way or to push us to act in a certain way. When we feel pleasure because our physiology is telling us that what we're doing is good due to inputs of evolutionary data that's been going into our DNA for millions of years. Now, obviously, things like modern-day junk food can hack that pleasure experience to get us to do things that are not good for us, like eat junk food. But that isn't really the point that I'm trying to make here. The point is that this should clue us into the reason for the existence of pleasure and the reason for the existence of pain. These are things that are there to push us or pull us in a certain direction and that are shaped by biological preference. So with that in mind, here's the passage, Will to Power, number 36, quote, "The philosophical nihilist is convinced that all that happens is meaningless and in vain, and that there ought not be anything meaningless and in vain. But whence this? There ought not be? From where does one get this meaning, this standard? At bottom, the nihilist thinks that the sight of such a bleak, useless existence makes a philosopher feel dissatisfied, bleak, desperate. Such an insight goes against our finer sensibility as philosophers. It amounts to the absurd valuation. To have any right to be, the character of existence would have to give the philosopher pleasure. Now it is easy to see that pleasure and displeasure can only be means in the course of events. The question remains whether we are at all able to find the meaning, the aim." End quote. So, of course, the idea that we could presume to judge existence based on whether it gives us pleasure or not is a pretty silly idea, because it makes pleasure and pain into ends instead of means. And that's the great problem with utilitarianism for Nietzsche. Pain and pleasure should be means. Utilitarian thinking makes them into ends. But those it becomes the only sensible goal one can follow, when all the other goals have sort of been, all the other places we've looked to find the substitute for those Christian ideas that redeem the world, when those come up empty, it becomes the only sensible goal, and it's substantially identical with nihilism in terms of content. It ultimately ends up representing degenerating life. Something else important emerges as we realize how far Nietzsche is willing to take this. So he has notes on the topic of decadence, and we see how this concept flows forth from that of nihilism. Or rather, both nihilism and decadence are a form of decay or sickness. One's expressed on the individual moral level, the other is a manifestation of the same underlying phenomenon on a societal level. Decadence and nihilism, they're both just different scales of manifestation of the same underlying phenomenon. And that's the phenomenon of exhaustion, weakness, declining life. For Nietzsche, the problem of decadence and nihilism are one and the same. They come from life running out of energy, becoming exhausted, wishing for the end. And I know this begins to seem tautological at a certain point, but it's important for understanding the causal relationship as he sees it, and how Nietzsche actually inverts the usual causal relationship in his moral thinking. So this is in Will to Power number 41, quote, "Basic insight regarding the nature of decadence. Its supposed causes are its consequences. This changes the whole perspective of moral problems. The whole moral struggle against vice, luxury, crime, even disease appears a naivete and superfluous. There is no improvement against repentance. Decadence itself is nothing to be fought. It is absolutely necessary and belongs to every age and every people. What should be fought vigorously is the contagion in the healthy parts of the organism." End quote. And so people look around at a dying society and they say the problem's crime, the problem's drugs, the problem is loose morals and personal vices. And Nietzsche says no. Crime is not a cause, it's a consequence. I mean, this wouldn't apply to all crime, obviously, but we'll say the crime that comes with the breakdown of the social order. Same with drug abuse, all these other vices, right? People fall into these as a result of decadence. Decadence is not a result of moral failings. And this is Nietzsche's repeated critique against moralism, against condemning reality on the basis of what ought to be. Decadence isn't something we can forestall with good moral behavior. That would be crazy. The social dissolution, that's part of that decadence. It's part of a natural process of a life form. In this case, a social structure, right? Or it's a collective existence of humans who are communal animals, and it's breaking down. So this is sort of it's a natural thing that happens in the life cycle of human organizations. He writes in section 40, quote, "The concept of decadence, waste, decay, elimination need not be condemned. They are necessary consequences of life, of the growth of life. The phenomenon of decadence is as necessary as any increase in advance of life. One is in no position to abolish it. Reason demands, on the contrary, that we do justice to it. It is a disgrace for all socialist systematizers that they suppose there could be circumstances, social combinations, in which vice, disease, prostitution, distress would no longer grow. But that means condemning life. A society is not free to remain young. And even at the height of its strength, it has to form refuse and waste materials. The more energetically and boldly it advances, the richer it will be in failures and deformities, the closer to decline. Age is not abolished by means of institutions. Neither is disease, nor vice." End quote. And so here we see the Nietzschean opposition to idealistic or progressive movements really is as simple as the fact that he doesn't believe mankind can be improved in that direction, and that if it could, it would be a disaster, right? But importantly, notice how he describes a society or a culture. It's in physiological terms. For Nietzsche, as we've discussed, the body is primary, and as such, he thinks we should look to the physiology when it comes to understanding the goals, the motives, and the pathologies of an organism. And the same holds true for a society. The problem is that we have taken the surface level symptoms to be the cause of mankind's condition, when really they're the symptoms. And so how does this tie in to the after effects of Christianity, which has sort of been the major through line in these notes? Because that's the specific kind of, what would you say, decadence that we're dealing with today. That's the particular kind of nihilism that the West is facing. So this is note number 44, quote, "Believing one chooses remedies, one chooses in fact that which hastens exhaustion. Christianity is an example, to name the greatest example of such an aberration of the instincts. Progress is just another instance." End quote. And so Christianity appears as a remedy, but for all the reasons we've been discussing, it only hastens us down the line to nihilism. And so remember, nihilism can be summed up in psychological terms as it's the expression or a response to the very physical decline of vital strength that Nietzsche is describing here. He writes in note number 48, quote, "Exhaustion can be acquired or inherited. In any case, it changes the aspect of things, the value of things. As opposed to those who, from the fullness they represent and feel, involuntarily give to things and see them fuller, more powerful, and pregnant with the future, who at least are able to bestow something, the exhausted diminish and botch all they see. They impoverish the value. They are harmful. About this, no mistake seems possible. Yet history contains the gruesome fact that the most exhausted have always been mistaken for the fullest, and the fullest for the most harmful." End quote. And so this is the framework we see underlying the master and slave morality and genealogy of morals. And it also ties into what Nietzsche talks about in the Antichrist. Those people who are the most full of life in his view, the warrior aristocracies of antiquity would be one example. They are those who feel empowered to forge their own values. They give life its greatest gifts. Meanwhile, the most exhausted souls, the most nihilistic, the most fed up with life, are mistaken for those fullest with life. And of course, Jesus would be who we're thinking of here. And because ultimately the master morality of the pagans is now vilified, whereas Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, right? Nietzsche goes on to write in many of these sections about how many of the psychological and social pathologies, as he sees them, could probably be traced to literal physical or mental illnesses. That this is where our problems actually come from. That when Nietzsche talks about a culture being sick or weak, he means it somewhat literally, insofar as he's saying there originates within the physiology of its constituent members an actual physical sickness. And this passage is interesting because it sort of suggests why this might be happening. So this is Will to Power number 52, quote, "Nature is not immoral when it has no pity for the degenerate. On the contrary, the growth of physiological and moral ills among mankind is the consequence of a pathological and unnatural morality. The sensibility of the majority of men is pathological and unnatural. Why is it that mankind is corrupt morally and physiologically? The body perishes when an organ is altered. The right of altruism cannot be derived from physiology, nor can the right to help and to an equality of lots. These are prizes for the degenerate and the underprivileged." End quote. So that's very harsh language, but Again, I'm big on being honest about what Nietzsche believed. His point overall, though, is the reason why a contentment or a safety-based society is degenerate is the very reason that it leads to a predominance of these physical pathologies that create moral and social dissolution. That in nature, those who are not well adjusted to the conditions of the ecosystem are selected out. Our moral systems, though, they've selected for all sorts of things which have nothing to do with fitness or survivability or mental or physical health. One could argue that the moral system of Christianity may have actively selected against some forms of mental or physical health. And one could make those arguments about our society today as well, but we'll leave that for another episode. In any case, Nietzsche argues in section 54 that, quote, virtue has been taught as mortification of the self, pity, even the negation of life. All these are the values of the exhausted, end quote. So, all those values obviously found in Christianity, but they're exhausted values. They appeared once as a remedy, but in fact hastened us toward the end. And now that we've abandoned God, we have not abandoned these exhausted values as a collective subject, because we are ultimately still exhausted, right? We haven't undertaken the revaluation. This is really the deep significance of Nietzsche's revaluation of values and the problem that he sees. We have searched for a means of redeeming the world from the curse we've laid on it through these life-denying values, but unless we can totally proceed to an active nihilist mindset and move past incomplete nihilism and complete the revaluation, we'll remain in this nihilistic void. And part of why it's maybe we shouldn't take this as political or social, although those levels of analysis are very useful to think about for understanding what Nietzsche is talking about. But one of the reasons why we maybe shouldn't think about it that way is because everything he's saying should indicate to you he doesn't think we have the energy as a society to transition to active nihilism necessarily. This is something that maybe you have to do on the individual level. And so, anyway, what society is doing now, I mean, all of our remaining energy is working towards increase of pleasure or decrease of displeasure. But none of that touches the question of meaning, and it's never a substitute for the answer to the questions of meaning. And Nietzsche writes, it's not distress that has increased or that leads him to predict this coming onset of nihilism. He writes in section 55, which is one of the longer sections, but I'll pick out just this little part, quote, a certain spiritual weakness that, owing to the long fight of philosophical opinions, has reached the most hopeless skepticism regarding all philosophy, end quote. And so I think that's a very honest assessment of where we're at. He compares this to the environment in which Buddhism came along, in which the people were trapped in the ravines of all these philosophical sort of arguments, right? He says the Indian society in the days of Buddha was as thought-obsessed as our society is, right? Which is not a compliment from Nietzsche, but nevertheless, so Nietzsche writes that European nihilism is still in the early stages. The earliest stages maybe when he's writing. It's not yet felt by the majority, but it is inevitable in his view, and we're still in what he calls the period of unclarity, although I would say we're fast dawning into the period of clarity, in my opinion, as to perceiving the nature of this problem, that our collective will is essentially aimed at nothing. When examined in terms of the underlying principles, and that this will continue us down a path of pathology and weakness of will. And as always, just as you can't fight aging by forming the right institutions, Nietzsche holds there's no moral or political set of actions that we can take to remedy the problem. All we would do is make it worse. So he predicts, in fact, the coming of a great catastrophe, which will sift men and force them to points of decision. It's during such catastrophic strife that new doctrines are created, or new tables of values, or what have you. And this is part of the natural process. It's the life cycle of societies. And this process just simply has to play out in order for something new to arise. And so, again, I don't think we should take this as essentially political or moral or sociologically. I think we should always examine the ways in which the Nietzschean philosophy can inform our own lives. So how can the Nietzschean understanding of nihilism inform our lives and our own philosophical or moral or spiritual development? How can we apply the model of having to pass fully through nihilism in order to discover or create something new? What does it mean to commit to a fully, quote-unquote, nihilistic attack in the active sense on one's previous values or convictions? If pathological nihilism, as he describes it, is at bottom a physiological condition, what are we to do with that exactly? Is there anything we can do about it? And if the real problem is not the suffering of the world, but the in vain, how is it that we find some means of giving ourselves that goal so it's not in vain, making life not in vain? How do we go about that? Nietzsche has his answers. He has his alternative religion of life. This is his assessment of Christianity. But I'll say no more on those questions I just raised because I think it would be good to just end on those questions. I think they're better left to all of you to contemplate. But so I guess we'll end there. Thanks for listening, everyone, and I will see you next week. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.